November 1942. North Africa. Somewhere outside Oran, Algeria. A German reconnaissance patrol, 6 men from the Africa Corps, lean and sun-scorched, veterans of 2 years in the sand, has been moving since dark. They have a mission. But what stops them in the end is not an enemy bullet or an allied flare. It is a smell. It drifts across the dunes from a direction they hadn't expected, northeast, behind the American lines, or what they estimate the American lines to be. The patrol leader, Unteroffizier Klaus Brandt, raises his fist. The men freeze. He tilts his head. He sniffs again. And then he does something no one in the patrol expects. He laughs. Not laughter born of fear, or the gallows humor of men who've been too long in the desert. Something else. Coffee, he whispers. The men exchange glances. Someone, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, behind an active front line, is brewing coffee. Not ersatz coffee, the roasted barley and chicory substitute that German soldiers had been drinking since 1940, the brown liquid that tasted of nothing and promised even less. This was real coffee. Ground, roasted, brewed. The smell was unmistakable to men who had not encountered it in 2 years. Brandt would later report the incident to his commanding officer. He included it almost as an afterthought, a footnote to what was otherwise a routine patrol debrief. But the intelligence officer who reviewed the report flagged it and passed it up the chain. Because it was not the first such report. It was not the 10th. Across North Africa, across the slowly shifting front lines, across the camps where American prisoners were taken and where German soldiers sometimes ventured close enough to smell the enemy's bivouac, the same observation kept recurring with the insistence of a drumbeat. The Americans had coffee. Real coffee. We've now covered 5 of America's most unlikely weapons: Spam, rations, candy, Coca-Cola, and now instant coffee. Each one tells the same story in a different flavor. Hit that like button and subscribe so you're there when we reveal the next one. We love seeing how far these videos travel, so let us know in the comments where you are watching from. To understand what coffee meant to a soldier in the Second World War, and why the American Army's relationship with it stunned every enemy and ally who encountered it, you need to understand what the world looked like from inside a canteen cup in 1942. By the time American forces entered the war in significant numbers following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, coffee had already become a casualty of conflict across most of Europe. Germany had been at war since 1939. Its pre-war coffee supply had depended almost entirely on imports, primarily from Brazil and Colombia, which the British naval blockade had systematically strangled. By 1940, real coffee had vanished from the German civilian market almost entirely. The substitute, Ersatzkaffee, a blend of roasted grain, chicory root, acorns, and whatever else the food chemists could make resemble coffee without actually being coffee, had become a bitter joke on the home front and a daily grievance at the front. German soldiers called it muckfuck, a term whose etymology is disputed but whose meaning was universally understood: brown water. Liquid disappointment. The Italian army was in a similar position. The Soviet Union, which did not share the Western world's deep cultural investment in coffee, at least had tea, and the famous brick tea of the Russian field kitchen, while no delicacy, was at least genuine. The British had their own severe rationing system. Coffee was not a British military staple in any case, but even tea, the cultural lifeblood of the British Tommy, was carefully rationed, allocated, and guarded with an almost religious ferocity. And then there were the Americans. The United States entered the war with several structural advantages that are well documented: industrial capacity, geographic insulation, natural resources, and the accumulated wealth of the world's largest economy. What is less often discussed is that it also entered the war with an almost uniquely intimate national relationship with coffee, and a military-industrial complex that had, over the preceding decade, developed the technological and logistical means to weaponize that relationship. Coffee was not a luxury for the American soldier. It was, in the precise and unambiguous language of U.S. Army Quartermaster doctrine, an operational necessity, as essential to the functioning of a combat unit as ammunition, as carefully allocated as fuel, as obsessively tracked through the supply chain as medical supplies. This was not sentiment. It was science, and it was strategy, and it had been in development long before the first American boot touched North African sand. The figure that recurs most often in post-war accounts, the number that German officers, when told it, consistently refused to believe on first hearing, is 40 pounds. 40 pounds of coffee per soldier per year. In a war where German soldiers considered themselves fortunate to receive genuine coffee at all, where a packet of real roasted beans was a black market treasure, traded among officers like currency, given as gifts for services rendered, the American Army was issuing its men an annual allocation of coffee that would have stocked a small German cafe for a month. The figure comes from official U.S. Army Quartermaster records. The exact allocation varied slightly by theater and year, but the baseline established by the Army's nutritional and morale planning documents for the European and Pacific theaters between 1942 and 1945 was approximately 40 pounds of roasted coffee per soldier per year, equivalent to roughly 1.75 ounces per day, sufficient to brew between 5 and 7 cups, depending on brewing method and strength preference. 5 to 7 cups per soldier per day. At the front, let that settle for a moment. The planning and infrastructure required to deliver that figure to hundreds of thousands of men scattered across multiple continents was not a simple logistical task. It was an achievement of staggering complexity, one that required the coordination of South American coffee growers, U.S. domestic roasters, the entire apparatus of the Army Quartermaster Corps, a global shipping network operating under U-boat threat, and a procurement bureaucracy that moved with a speed and efficiency that few government agencies, before or since, have matched. It also required, crucially, a technological breakthrough that changed not just how the American Army drank its coffee, but how the world would drink coffee for the next 50 years. Soluble coffee and the instant revolution. By 1940, instant coffee, soluble coffee, as it was known, was not a new concept. The Japanese-American chemist Satoru Kato had patented a soluble coffee preparation as early as 1903. George Constant Lewis Washington, a Belgian-American entrepreneur, had been marketing his own instant coffee product since 1910, and American soldiers in the First World War had received it in their rations. But the early instant coffees were mediocre at best, thin, flat, prone to clumping, and widely despised by anyone who had ever tasted the real article. What changed everything was a partnership between the United States military and the Nestle Corporation that produced, in 1938, a product called Nescafé, and a subsequent wartime push to develop military-grade soluble coffee of sufficient quality to be drunk by millions of men in the most demanding conditions on Earth. The engineering challenge was formidable. Coffee that could survive transport from a roasting facility in the United States to a foxhole in Tunisia, or a destroyer in the North Pacific, or a jungle outpost in New Guinea, had to withstand temperature extremes ranging from sub-zero Arctic cold to 100-degree tropical heat. It had to resist moisture, oxidation, and the physical trauma of being thrown around in the hold of a Liberty ship for 6 weeks. It had to dissolve instantly in water that might be cold, brackish, or barely safe to drink. And it had to taste, at the end of all this, like coffee, not like the brown ghost that had been haunting German canteens for 2 years. The U.S. Army's solution involved 3 parallel tracks. First, the Army invested heavily in improving the spray drying process for soluble coffee, the method by which brewed coffee is converted into powder by being forced through a nozzle as a fine mist into a heated chamber. The resulting powder was lighter, more stable, and more soluble than earlier formulations. Second, the Army worked with civilian food scientists to develop hermetically sealed, nitrogen-flushed packaging that could preserve coffee's aromatic compounds, the volatile oils that carry most of its flavor, for months after processing. Third, it established procurement contracts with every major coffee roaster in the United States, effectively placing the civilian coffee industry on a war footing. The results were issued to American soldiers as part of the standard K ration, the C ration, and the 10-in-1 ration, the three primary field ration systems used by American forces throughout the war. Every K ration included a small packet of soluble coffee, sufficient for 1 cup. Every C ration included a separate beverage packet with coffee and sugar. The 10-in-1 ration, designed for small units operating independently, included coffee sufficient for multiple brews per man per day, along with a small packaged creamer. But soluble coffee was only part of the story. When conditions permitted, and American logistical doctrine worked very hard to ensure that conditions permitted as often as possible, soldiers were issued ground roasted coffee in sealed cans, brewed in Lister bags, in field ranges, in improvised setups over makeshift fires. The Army had a formal classification system for rations. Class A rations, fresh food, cooked in proper kitchens. Class B, canned and packaged, cooked in field kitchens. Class C, individual canned rations for combat conditions, and Class D, emergency rations. Coffee appeared in all 4 classes at every level of the system, from the garrison mess hall to the muddy foxhole. It was, in the most literal sense, ubiquitous. The smell the enemy could not ignore. By the time American forces were engaged in significant ground combat, in North Africa from late 1942, in Italy from 1943, in France from mid-1944, the presence of coffee in the American lines had become a tactical constant that German intelligence noted with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Captured German officers, processed through American prisoner-of-war handling facilities, were almost universally offered coffee. This was standard practice, part of the initial processing routine, a deliberate act of both hospitality and psychological calculation. The effect was documented repeatedly in U.S. Army intelligence reports from multiple theaters. A First Army Intelligence Summary from Tunisia, dated March 1943, notes that 2 captured officers from the 10th Panzer Division, upon being offered coffee during initial processing, consumed it with what the processing officer described as extraordinary intensity and asked on 3 separate occasions whether it was real coffee or a substitute. When told it was real, imported, roasted, genuine coffee, one of the officers reportedly sat in silence for a full minute before responding that he had not tasted real coffee in 14 months. 14 months. The same summary notes that the officer then asked how the Americans were able to supply coffee to a frontline facility and was told that it was standard issue, that every American soldier received it as a matter of course. The intelligence officer's dry annotation in the margin reads, "Subject appeared to find this difficult to credit." This scene, with variations, would repeat itself in prisoner processing facilities from Tunisia to Tokyo. The coffee question, the incredulity, the repeated verification, the extended silence, became so common that American intelligence officers began including it as a structured element of initial prisoner interviews, using the subject's reaction to coffee as a data point in assessing enemy morale and supply conditions. What they found, consistently, was that the revelation of American coffee abundance, more than discussions of tank production, aircraft numbers, or industrial output, provoked a visceral, personal recognition in German prisoners. Numbers could be disbelieved, dismissed as propaganda, argued with. The smell of coffee, and the knowledge of how systematically it had been put there, could not. The scale of the American coffee enterprise during the Second World War is, even by the standards of American wartime production, remarkable. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States military purchased and distributed approximately 2.5 billion pounds of coffee, a figure that accounts for roughly one-third of total U.S. coffee consumption during that period, in a country that was itself already the world's largest coffee consumer. This was not simply buying a lot of coffee. It was reorganizing an entire commodity supply chain around military requirements. The procurement operation required to sustain these numbers was itself a minor marvel of bureaucratic efficiency. The Army Quartermaster Corps established long-term contracts with Brazilian and Colombian coffee growers, the two largest producers in the world, that effectively guaranteed American access to raw coffee beans regardless of global market fluctuations. Roasting contracts were distributed across dozens of American commercial facilities, converting civilian capacity to military production with a speed that reflected both the urgency of the need and the responsiveness of American industry to government wartime contracts. The packaging innovation was equally significant. The hermetically sealed tin can, vacuum-packed, lithographed with military specifications, stamped with lot numbers and packing dates, was not a new invention, but its systematic application to coffee preservation at military scale was a genuine advance. Coffee packed in these cans and shipped from roasting facilities in the United States arrived in the field weeks or months later with aromatic compounds sufficiently preserved to be recognizably coffee rather than merely caffeinated dust. The logistics chain that made this possible, from the Brazilian fazenda to the American roasting plant to the military packaging facility to the Liberty ship to the forward supply dump to the mess sergeant's urn, was tested, refined, and stress-tested again across every theater of the war. It worked, consistently, at a scale no other military on Earth could approach. The German ersatz system, by contrast, produced approximately 73,000 tons of Ersatzkaffee in 1942, the peak production year, using facilities that consumed grain and chicory root that might otherwise have fed the civilian population. The product was universally despised, consumed out of necessity rather than any pretense of pleasure, and functioned as a persistent, daily reminder to every German soldier and civilian that the war was costing them something real. Something they had previously taken for granted. Something that, across the front lines in North Africa and France and Italy, the Americans seemed to have in inexhaustible abundance. The symbolic weight of this disparity was not lost on German propaganda analysts. As early as 1941, the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Goebbels' ministry, produced internal memoranda discussing the morale impact of coffee scarcity and recommending strategies to reframe Ersatzkaffee as a patriotic choice rather than a deprivation. The campaign met with limited success. When the alternative to a patriotic choice is actual coffee, patriotism has a ceiling. What the cup said about the country behind it. There is a concept in military psychology, discussed at length in the post-war analyses produced by both American and German military historians, that might be called supply morale. The idea is straightforward. A soldier's confidence in his own side is not determined solely by his assessment of tactical capability or strategic position. It is shaped, at a deep and often unconscious level, by the evidence available to him of what his nation is willing and able to do on his behalf. Hot food is supply morale. Dry socks are supply morale. Medical care in the forward area is supply morale. And coffee, real coffee, arriving in a sealed packet in a ration that has traveled thousands of miles to reach a man's hands in a foxhole, is supply morale distilled to its essence. The German army, by 1942, had begun to lose the supply morale war. Not in the sense that German soldiers lacked courage or determination. The Wehrmacht remained a formidable fighting force until the last weeks of the war, and its soldiers' individual bravery was never in question. But the accumulating evidence of what Germany could not provide, the ersatz coffee, the thinning rations, the boots that wore out and were not replaced, the letters from home describing shortages, created a persistent, background corrosion of the certainty that a soldier needs to sustain himself through the long attrition of a modern industrial war. Coffee, in this context, was not merely a beverage. It was a message. And the message arrived daily, in every American mess line and every prisoner processing facility and every supply dump that German patrols could smell from across the wire. The message was, "We have more than you think. We will not run out. We planned for this." The American military's decision to classify coffee as an operational necessity, to embed it in every combat ration, to fund the research and procurement and packaging infrastructure required to deliver it reliably to the front, was a decision that encoded a set of values about the relationship between a democratic government and the men it sends to fight. It said, in the unambiguous language of institutional behavior, these men matter enough to feed well, to caffeinate properly, to treat as human beings with preferences and needs, not merely as instruments of force projection. This was not a message that the Wehrmacht's supply doctrine was capable of sending. Not because German commanders did not care about their soldiers. Many did deeply, but because the system they operated within had been designed for a different kind of war, and had been broken by 1942 under the weight of its own overextension. The prisoner interviews are, in many ways, the most vivid evidence of how this disparity registered at the individual human level. At the newly established prisoner facilities in England following the Normandy landings in 1944, American and British intelligence officers conducted structured initial interviews with captured German personnel. The protocols, preserved in the National Archives, include a standardized notation for what interviewers termed supply-related morale indicators, observations about how prisoners reacted to the food and drink they were offered during processing. Coffee appears in these notations with remarkable frequency. A report from a processing center in Oxfordshire, dated July 1944, describes a captured Hauptfeldwebel from the 716th Infantry Division who, upon being offered a mug of coffee during his intake interview, held it in both hands for an extended period, apparently approximately 1 minute, without drinking. When the interviewing officer asked if something was wrong, the man reportedly said, "I'm trying to remember the last time I held something like this." The notation concludes, subject cooperative throughout interview. Described coffee as the first real coffee he had consumed since deployment to France in January 1944, a period of approximately 6 months. A second report from the same facility describes a younger prisoner, a Gefreiter, barely 20 years old, who had been captured during fighting near Caen, asking his interviewing officer, with what the report describes as genuine and unsettling sincerity, whether American soldiers drank coffee every day. The officer confirmed that they did. The young man's recorded response, "Then they wanted to be here. We never wanted to be anywhere we had to go." The psychology of that observation, a 20-year-old soldier constructing his analysis of the war's fundamental asymmetry through the lens of a beverage, is worth sitting with. He was not wrong. The American soldier was not merely better supplied than his German counterpart. He was supplied in a way that communicated, at every meal and every break, that the nation behind him had committed its full industrial and organizational capacity to his welfare, that he was valued, that his comfort mattered. That is a different thing from being brave. It is a different thing from being well-trained. It is something quieter and more durable, and in the long arithmetic of a war that lasted years, perhaps more decisive. The psychological impact of American coffee abundance was not confined to enlisted men and junior prisoners. It registered at the highest levels of German command, and it registered not as a trivial observation but as a strategic inference about the nature of the enemy they were facing. General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most celebrated German commander of the early war, the man who had driven the British back and forth across North Africa with a tactical virtuosity that had made him famous even among his enemies, was by 1942 deeply aware of the supply asymmetry he faced. His letters home, published posthumously as the Rommel Papers, are full of references to logistical constraints, to the impossibility of sustaining his campaign without supply lines that simply did not exist in sufficient depth. What he understood, and what he communicated with increasing urgency to Berlin, was that the Americans were not fighting the way the Germans had expected them to fight. They were not just throwing men and tanks at the problem. They were burying it under weight, under tonnage, under the sheer material confidence of a nation that had decided to win and had the industrial metabolism to follow through on that decision. Coffee was a small piece of this picture, but Rommel was a general who paid attention to small things, and the small thing of American coffee, its ubiquity, its quality, its presence in the hands of men who had just crossed 3,000 miles of ocean to fight him, was a data point he could not ignore. It spoke of an enemy whose supply chain had been designed not for a campaign but for a civilization's sustained projection of force. He did not have an answer to that. Nobody in the Wehrmacht did. The strategic significance of American coffee logistics in the Second World War operates at several distinct levels, and it is worth examining each one, because together they tell a story not just about a beverage but about how modern industrial democracies project power. The first and most direct level is performance. Caffeine, the active compound in coffee, is the most widely consumed psychoactive substance in human history, and its effects on cognitive function under stress are well documented. A caffeine-habituated adult deprived of their regular intake experiences a measurable decline in alertness, reaction time, and executive function within 12 to 24 hours. In a combat environment, where reaction time is measured in fractions of a second, where the decision to fire or hold fire can determine who lives, this is not a trivial variable. The American soldier who started his day with coffee was, in neurochemical terms, a marginally but consistently sharper instrument than a German soldier who started his with ersatz. Over thousands of engagements, over years of daily contact, those margins compound. The second level is logistics signaling. The capacity to deliver coffee, reliably, consistently, at scale, across multiple continents, was itself a demonstration of logistical depth that had direct implications for German strategic planning. Every German intelligence officer who noted American coffee availability in the forward area was updating the same assessment. The American supply chain could deliver non-essential luxuries to the front line as a matter of routine. If they could do that, what were they doing with the essential items? The answer, as Rommel grasped in Africa, as von Rundstedt understood in France, was that they were delivering everything. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, communications equipment, replacement parts, and, yes, coffee. The entire supply apparatus operated with a depth and redundancy that German logistics simply could not match, had never been designed to match, and had no realistic prospect of matching given the resource constraints under which the Wehrmacht operated by 1943. The third level is morale arithmetic. This has been discussed in detail above, but its strategic dimension deserves emphasis. A force whose soldiers begin each day with evidence of their nation's commitment to their welfare is, over time, a more reliable instrument than one whose soldiers begin each day with evidence of its inadequacy. German morale reports from Normandy, captured by Allied intelligence and subsequently analyzed in detail, show a consistent pattern. Units that had been in continuous contact, without reliable supply, for extended periods showed measurable degradation in cohesion, initiative, and willingness to hold ground. Units that had been rotated, rested, and resupplied showed the opposite. American units also suffered. They also experienced supply failures, tactical reverses, and the grinding horror of sustained combat. But the baseline, the floor below which the American supply system was designed not to fall, was substantially higher than the German equivalent. Coffee was one small but symbolically weighted dimension of that baseline. The fourth level is the one that is hardest to quantify but maybe most important: institutional confidence. The American Army's ability to feed its men well, caffeinate them reliably, and treat their daily comfort as an operational priority was not an accident or a stroke of luck. It was the military presence brought genuine coffee back to German cities. The reaction was, by multiple accounts, something close to collective catharsis. Coffee had been absent for 5 years. Its return was not experienced simply as the return of a pleasant beverage. It was experienced as the return of normalcy, of peace, of a world that had room for small pleasures again. The Americans, who had been drinking it all along, could not quite understand the emotional register of their German counterparts' response to a cup of coffee. But perhaps they should have. Because the men who had spent years in the field, starting every day with a sealed packet of soluble coffee issued as a matter of right by a government that considered their comfort an operational priority, those men understood, at some level, what a cup of coffee means when you've been told you don't deserve one. It means everything. There are many ways to measure the distance between the United States and Germany in the Second World War. You can measure it in aircraft production, 300,000 American planes against 120,000 German. You can measure it in steel output, in shipping tonnage, in the number of divisions fielded, in the miles of railroad track laid, in the acres of farmland under cultivation. These are the numbers that appear in the standard accounts, the metrics of industrial war that historians have been analyzing for 8 decades. But there is another way to measure that distance. A smaller way. A more human way. 40 pounds of coffee per soldier per year. That number, issued as a ration, delivered as a right, maintained across thousands of miles of ocean and supply line and combat zone, encodes within it an entire theory of what a democratic nation owes the men it sends to fight on its behalf. It says, you are not just an instrument. You are a person. Your daily comfort is not a distraction from the mission. It is part of the mission. We have counted it, budgeted it, shipped it, and we will get it to you. The Germans had brave soldiers. They had brilliant tacticians. They had, in certain narrow domains, technically superior equipment. What they did not have, what the system under which they fought made structurally product of years of planning, research, procurement, and investment. Investment made by a government that had decided, before the fighting began, that it was going to take care of its people. That decision shaped the war's outcome in ways that extend far beyond coffee. But coffee is where it was visible. Coffee is where German soldiers smelled it across the wire at night, and stopped, and listened to the sound of an industrial civilization that had decided to win. The American coffee program of the Second World War did not end with the armistice. Its consequences rippled forward through the 20th century in ways that touched the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people who have never thought about their morning cup in a military context. The soluble coffee technology developed and refined for the U.S. military ration program formed the foundation of the post-war instant coffee industry. The hermetic packaging techniques developed to preserve coffee's aromatic compounds through months of military distribution became standard in the civilian food industry. The procurement relationships established between the U.S. government and South American coffee producers during the war helped shape the post-war global coffee trade. More diffusely, the war introduced millions of American servicemen, many of whom had grown up in households where coffee was not a daily habit, or where it was an expensive luxury, to regular, reliable, high-quality coffee consumption as a normalized feature of daily life. When those men came home, they brought the habit with them. The post-war American coffee boom of the late 1940s and 1950s, the era of the percolator on every kitchen counter, The coffee break as an established workplace institution, the diner cup as a cultural fixture, was shaped, in measurable ways, by 4 years of military coffee education on a mass scale. Germany, meanwhile, had its own coffee moment after the war, a moment of its own that carried a different kind of weight. When the occupation began and the American impossible to have, was this particular form of institutional care. The care that says, even in the mud, even at the front, even when we are asking everything of you, you will have your coffee. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. It is the signature of a civilization that has made a choice about what it values, and has backed that choice with the full weight of its industrial capacity and its organizational will. Unteroffizier Klaus Brandt, lying in the cold North African desert in November 1942, smelling coffee from the American lines, he didn't know any of this. He knew only that the smell was real, that it shouldn't have been there, and that its presence said something he didn't have quite the words for yet. He would spend the next 2 years finding those words. And when he finally did, in a prisoner facility somewhere in England or America, sitting across a table from a man who handed him a cup without being asked, they would be very simple words. Of course they won. Of course.